Brought to you by Chemistry.
Hello and welcome back to Brought to you by Chemistry. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Lathbridge, and in today's episode, we're talking about antimicrobial discovery and drug development. Super fun topic, I know. Joining me are two wonderful experts who can help bring this topic to life. Dr. Vicky Savage, microbiologist and head of biology at Infex Therapeutics, and Professor Colm Leonard, honorary professor of respiratory medicine and consultant at the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. To start with, I know this is a very difficult question. I'm going to start with you, Colm. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Colm Leonard. I'm a clinical advisor to the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and I'm also an NHS consultant respiratory physician.
Wonderful. Vicky, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Vicky Savage. I'm a microbiologist and I've got an interest in antibiotic resistance mechanisms and developing new medicines that overcome antimicrobial resistance. I've worked in academia and industry where I've been for about 10 years now. I'm also head of biology for Infex Therapeutics. So we're a biotech based in the Northwest in Cheshire. And we've got an interest in developing new therapies for infections that have a high level of unmet medical need. So AMR, of course, is a key area with a high unmet medical need. And so much of our research is focused around developing new antibiotics and other types of medicines that overcome AMR. The biology team at Infex do a variety of research that helps us understand how our developmental therapeutics interact with bacteria and how likely resistance is to arise to these new drugs.
Oh, wow. I can see you're staying warm today by doing lots and lots of things. So, I mean, with that in mind, I guess I'll start with you, Vicky. Could you give us a brief sort of basic rundown on the history of the discovery of antimicrobials and antibiotics? Because I know it's quite long.
Yeah, it goes back a long way, the sort of antibiotic history. So it depends how far you want to take it, really. But it's quite fascinating. Antibiotics have actually been essential to humankind long before we knew indeed what they were or how to purify them as medicines. There's good wealth of evidence now that shows that ancient civilizations, in fact, sort of ancient Egypt and so on, consumed antibiotics by drinking things like beer that contained bacteria that produced antibiotics, or using poultices of moldy bread where there was mold on the bread that produced antibiotics. And these remedies were used to treat things like gum disease and other ailments. And we know this in part because you can actually find traces of antibiotics, like tetracycline, in the bones of people from these populations. So, the history of antibiotics goes back a very long way to relatively modern history, where we can actually produce and purify antibiotics and use them as medicines. And the first antibiotic, Salvarsan, was developed by Paul Ehrlich in around 1910. Fast forward a bit further, and we had the very famous discovery of penicillin by Fleming in around 1928. And then came what is sort of broadly referred to as the golden age of antibiotic drug discovery, where developers were finding a new class of antibiotics virtually, every year. And this ranged from about the 1940s to the 1960s. And now, even today, the vast majority of antibiotics that are used are natural products which have been derived from soil organisms and molds, So we're now in a position where bacteria are still evolving resistance mechanisms to all our antibiotic arsenal, and antibiotic drug discovery has very much slowed down. So really, that's the brief history of antibiotics, if you like.
Colm and I both appreciate the conciseness of that. Consistency doesn't matter. So, Colm, I was going to say, could you please give us a little bit of a insight into you and your work? Because the only thing I really know from you from the last couple of minutes is that you're someone that very much agrees that it's a bad idea to have arsenic-based drugs given to the general public.
Yeah, yeah. So, I sort of in my distant memory, I certainly remember it was a film called Arsenic and Old Lace or something like that. But no, I'm practicing chest physician for 50% of my time. So, and in fact, a big chunk of my career has been looking after people with severe lung disease, particularly patients with end-stage diseases that would potentially require lung transplantation. And for over 20 years of my career looking after people after lung transplant operations and heart transplant operations and artificial heart operations. And these patients are particularly susceptible to not just infections, but resistant infections. And so I have a lot of first-hand experience of having problems with antibiotic resistance and trying to find appropriate treatments, and also dealing with complications of those treatments, whether that's renal toxicity and so on. So, for better or for worse, I'm afraid I have quite a bit of experience of the problems with antibiotic resistance and lack of new drugs coming through, and also the toxicities of the new drugs. And then in my work with NICE, we've been involved in some work trying to make antibiotic discovery and development more attractive and sustainable.
Very briefly, who are NICE?
So NICE is an organisation called National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and they were set up over 20 years ago with a reasonably broad remit that essentially is to try and ensure that whether it's new drug treatments or new pathways of care or new medical technologies, that the NHS gets best advice, and that the NHS, if you like, has an opportunity to have the cost effectiveness of certain treatments assessed, and there's a best use of resources and best guidance for clinicians and patients in the National Health Service. Really NICE are supposed to reduce postcode prescribing and improve quality of care, be that around use of medications or defining better pathways of care for treatments and defining best use of medical technologies.
Okay, and so like with that, because you mentioned sort of as a practicing physician having first-hand perspective on the effects of antimicrobial resistance. I mean, what is that like for you? You know, because you have those two sides of you. You have both seeing patients and working with NICE to understand policy at a higher level. Like, what is that balance like to you?
It can be quite chaotic, actually, but it's really helpful in the sense to straddle the fence between things that are, developing national policies or guidance, but also having that frontline experience that hopefully helps influence NICE's outputs being real world and practical. And it also helps to sort of make the case sometimes for the importance of a particular piece of work or medication or technology because of that first-hand experience. But of course, my main experience is in the respiratory arena, but the work I do for NICE is across specialties. So it's really helpful as a clinician to have those clinical networks of colleagues, be they in the Northwest where I'm based or around the country, to where I can touch base with them to make sure I get best advice, be it a specialty outside my own clinical area.
Oh, okay, wow. And so, I mean, I guess bouncing off of that to you, Vicky, because Holmes mentioned that we have so many issues around antimicrobial resistance, and with the NHS trying to get medication, trying to get drugs at sort of the most efficient, best price and stuff. But when it comes to actually making drugs, actually discovering drugs, you mentioned a bit earlier, talking about sort of the history of drugs, sort of antimicrobials, and what are actually the steps involved in getting a new drug developed, or at least discovering a drug and getting it into clinical pathways?
I mean, and depending on who you ask, you can split it into lots of different stages or just a few. Of course, the first stage is discovery. So a lot of this will happen in sort of academia. So in universities do a great deal of target identification and sort of the early stages of drug discovery, trying to find fragments or small molecules that can inhibit these targets. And then after that, that can be quite a long stage, many, many years. But then once the hit is identified, it would move into preclinical development. And this in of itself can be split into several stages. So you've got the hit to lead phase, where you're taking something that's inhibiting a target and you're trying to make it more drug-like. You move into lead optimization, where again, you're trying to make it more drug-like and sort of refine its efficacy. And you're also looking at infection models to see if your drug can treat infection in animal models. After that, you move into regulatory toxicology studies, where you're doing quite expensive toxicology studies that are in line with what your national regulator will require before a drug could go into clinical trials. And assuming that's all okay, you will then move into clinical development, which is sort of split into phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 1, you're usually looking at healthy volunteers, relatively small number of them, and you're looking at safety and how the drug behaves in the human body effectively. Phase 2, looking at patients, again looking at safety, but also efficacy and how your drug compares with what's normally used in that infection type. And then phase 3, many, many more patients, looking again at safety and efficacy, trying to spot any rarer side effects, that sort of thing. And all being well, you'll then apply to your regulator to be able to use your drug on the market which they cover. And then after that, you'll be doing post-marketing studies where you're, again, looking for rare side effects, which you wouldn't have found in the smaller number of patients you've got in clinical trials, and following things like resistance as well. How does your drug behave in real-world use? So overall, it probably takes about 10 to 15 years from sort of early stages of drug development through to launch of a drug. And it'll probably cost about $1 to $2 billion. And probably with inflation these days, it's probably on the higher end of that.
So it's in the billions.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. That sounds ridiculous to me. Right, Colm, you're nodding your head.
No, I'm nodding to agree with it in the billions, not agreeing that it's ridiculous. It's an enormous amount of money to develop a new antibiotic.
Where is that cost? What is that? Is there some part of it that costs the most?
Because generally, as you get further into the process, so large clinical trials, you're talking multiple sites, potentially across the globe. These are enormous studies involving tons of people, and they cost millions and millions, and developers might do several of these. Manufacturing a drug can be very expensive, and each stage of these processes is sort of a cumulative effect, or the costs add up. And kind of, let's not forget, so developers have got to try and recoup that $1 to $2 billion for that successful drug, but only around 5% of programs will make it from early stages of drug development through to launch. So they've also got to recoup the sunken costs for all the programs that didn't make it as well. And this is really what we're up against.
Wow, I didn't realize it was so much there. So with that in mind, I think maybe Colm, you might have perspective on this, but how does this get paid for? How does this cost in sort of drug discovery and manufacturing and all these clinical trials and stuff translate into cost in terms of healthcare, especially in the UK with the NHS and stuff?
Well, that's really a key point in the sense that Vicky has laid the groundwork for this really well, because the reality is when a new antibiotic comes to market, in general, the comparators are relatively cheap and often generic. And so a new antibiotic comes to market, a company has spent, as Vicky said, perhaps between $1 and $2 billion developing it. And firstly, the antibiotic doesn't get used very much because new antibiotics are appropriate to reserve and try and what we call steward them best so that we don't encourage early emergence of resistance. So levels of usage tend to be low. The course of treatment for antibiotics is usually short. It can be a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, and in smaller situations, smaller percentages, longer than that. So it's very hard for companies to recoup that development cost. And that has led to this concept of a market failure where a number of companies have filed for bankruptcy in the last few years, even when they've successfully brought important new antibiotics to market. A number of companies have failed to launch in Europe and the UK, or very delayed launch because of that difficulty around market entry and getting reimbursement on an appropriate level. And thirdly, the reason that it's difficult for companies to recoup cost, it's not just the low levels of usage, the relatively modest price, but it's also the fact that with antibiotics, the value assessment is totally inadequate. If you look at costs of antibiotics compared with, for example, oncology drugs, while there are many oncology drugs that are potentially life-saving, some of the newer drugs are really just life-extending for weeks or months, as opposed to an antibiotic that can be truly curative and life-saving. And yet you have oncology drugs costing, tens of thousands of pounds for a patient's treatment, or more than that. And, an antibiotic that costs, really tiny amounts of money, even, in the sort of hundreds of dollars, or £1,000 or £2,000, for a course of treatment. So there's a real issue that the standard reimbursement mechanisms for new drugs, where a company brings, a new drug for, let's just say a condition like, rheumatoid arthritis, or and they will try and sell that to as many patients as possible, and are able to achieve a high price because the system values those drugs much more highly than antibiotics. And so there's a real problem that this market failure has caused largely big pharma companies to move away from antimicrobial development. And it's caused, as I say, a real problem with the area now being serviced mainly by small companies who tend to be underfunded in very precarious financial positions.
Oh, I mean, just on that point, now this may sound like a very stupid question, so both of you feel free to hide your grimaces when I ask it. But when you have an antimicrobial, when you have a drug that's been developed, and let's say a big company has developed it, they've got this drug out, it's a molecule, right? You can look it up, you can be like, this is a molecule. What's stopping, any generic company just, copying that, putting it out there, manufacturing, putting it out there? I'm thinking of it in terms of, like Apple AirPods, the headphones. As soon as that technology came out, you could then very easily on Amazon buy very cheap copies, cheap imitations of that, and they were sort of everywhere, saturating the market. So what's stopping people from creating sort of generic drugs that then the pharmaceutical companies don't get that money, and then those drugs sort of flood the market?
No, not a stupid question at all. So
yes,
drugs, like anything else that you can buy, the company who's developed them will have intellectual property around that drug. That can be on the structure of the drug, similar structures, how it's made, what it's used for. And that intellectual property protects that product and the company from someone else making it. So when the drug finally gets to market, if it's successful, the developer has a period of time known as the exclusivity period. So it's usually 5 to 10 years that the company has. And in that time, generics companies are not allowed to copy it and not allowed to make it. And then once that period of time runs out, then the product is then off patent, and then that's when generics companies can come in and make it more cheaply. So based on what Colin was just saying before, antibiotics aren't really used; they're sort of kept on the shelf for patients who absolutely need them, to try and support stewardship. So we preserve the sort of longevity of that drug against resistance. But then, developers are up against the clock. They've only got that 5 to 10 year period to try and make back that $1 to $2 billion that we discussed before. So, we have this finite amount of time where developers are frantically trying to sort of recoup their sunken costs in that product.
So is that balance? You've got a drug that you've developed that's sort of maybe, a success of 5%, and all the other drugs that you tried to develop, they failed somewhere along that pipeline. You've still got to recoup that cost, and that sunk cost then goes into this drug that has worked. Then the companies want to recoup that cost by the drug being sold and being used. But Colm, on your side, as clinicians, you don't want to prescribe that drug. You want to steward it in only for, to prevent antimicrobial resistance from building up. So how does that work? How do you balance that? How do you get the drug sold and used more and more when you don't want to really use it a lot, because you want to make sure that you keep it still as useful as possible?
Well, the key thing is it doesn't work, and that's why companies have been filing for bankruptcy and failing to launch or delaying launch outside the United States. And so that's partly what was the problem that was significantly commented on in one of the key reports around AMR. So Lord Jim O'Neill was commissioned by David Cameron's government at the time to produce a report on antimicrobial resistance, and it's quite a wide-ranging report. But in terms of antibiotic development and sustainable antibiotic pipeline, he made some recommendations around something called push incentives to encourage early development of the type that Vicky has talked about earlier on. But he also introduced a concept called pull incentives, where he recognized this market failure and commented that it could take, in theory, over 20 years for a company to recoup their development costs for a new antimicrobial. And what he meant by pull incentives to fix that issue were payments to companies that bring a new product to market that were independent of volume of sales. So therefore, a company that brought a new antibiotic to market could happily accept the fact that that would, in a sense, sit on the shelf for a period of time and be appropriately held back or stewarded, but nonetheless that they would get reimbursed at a level that would help them recoup their development costs. And of course, it's not just the $1 to $2 billion that Vicky talked about to get an antimicrobial to market. It's been estimated that in the first 10 years after an antibiotic comes to market, that you probably need something of the order of $350 million in that first 10 years to account for, surveillance and post-marketing studies and manufacturing and so on.
Okay, and so what does that look like what does that look for in terms of our healthcare system, in terms of the NHS? How can the NHS, I've heard about the sort of the NHS subscription purchasing model. What is that, and is that unique to just the UK?
So I'm happy to talk about that. So this UK subscription model, so this work was commenced as a consequence of the O'Neill report, which published in 2016, and the UK government responded positively to the recommendations in that report in a number of areas, including pull incentives. So NICE have been working for a number of years with NHS England and with significant support from the Department of Health and Social Care on a project where we developed a new methodology to more fully assess the value of new antibiotics. So we would take on board the fact that there are benefits to antibiotics beyond the individual patient that they help, in the sense that not only are they enabling for that patient, whether it's to have hip surgery or a transplant operation or chemotherapy or treatment for a particular infection, but they also enable other procedures in the sense that if you have somebody stuck in a hospital bed with a resistant bug, it's not just that patient that's impacted, but that bed can't be used for somebody else to have their bypass operation or hip surgery. And so we've evolved a different methodology that has attempted to assess more fully the value of antibiotics beyond individual benefits to patients. That's one section of it. And then using that value assessment on two antimicrobials as part of a test project. We then have initiated in July this year fixed payments delinked from volume of sales to two companies that produce those two products. And those payments will be fixed for initial 3 years with an option to extend for up to 10 years. And the maximum contract value for each antibiotic is a maximum payment of £10 million per year for up to 10 years. And so that's the first situation anywhere in the world where somebody has delivered a novel reimbursement mechanism based on a more holistic value assessment of two antibiotics. And we're hoping that other countries will adapt or adopt that approach to try and achieve a more global type pull incentive to make antibiotic development more attractive.
Okay, so just Vicky, just before I come to you, very quickly, Colm. So does that mean, if you can answer it briefly, does that mean the NHS then pays for drugs even if no one uses them in that sort of period?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
This financial models and all of this, like, what do these sort of incentives mean for your work in your field, or for companies like Infex Therapeutics?
Yeah, I mean, I think most antibiotic drug development is done by small companies, particularly in the UK. There's no UK-based large pharmaceutical company involved in antibiotic drug development at the moment. There's only about 12 small companies in the UK working in antibiotics. So these pull incentives are really important for organizations of all sizes. Small companies generally won't take a drug from discovery all the way through to market just because of the amount of money required. It's generally the sort of general mechanism is that a small company will do a deal with a large pharmaceutical company who will then pay for the commercialization and all the marketing costs that go with it, and then share the revenue downstream. So really what the reimbursement mechanisms mean for small companies is that it'll be hopefully easier. It would look more lucrative to large pharmaceutical companies to get involved in antibiotic drug development again. And if that happens, it also brings in private investment back into small companies. So because of the market failure for antibiotics, getting private investment in this space is difficult. So, hopefully it should reinvigorate the space on both of those fronts, both drawing more interest from big pharma again, and then also private investment. And of course, if we do that, then, more companies will be involved in the space. And then you've got that sort of critical mass of scientific research happening to hopefully bring, many more new drugs to market for patients.
So this is looking at it from very sort of a company model, very sort of economics model, and even healthcare. But going back into sort of the science of it, like I'm involved in this, like antimicrobials have been a thing, like you said, even all the way back to like ancient Egypt. And do we not by now have in our pocket, the knowledge that, okay, I know that this drug from the 50s worked quite well, but antimicrobial resistance came up very, very, very quickly. Can we mix and match in terms of drug discovery? I know this, phenol group. I know that this sort of chemical structure will work. Do we have a library of little things that can streamline drug discovery and make things easier? Are there bits of chemistry or microbiology that we've that we've got stored up that makes this stuff easier? This is the point where you say, yeah, we're smashing it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to caveat all the next statements with I'm a biologist, not a chemist, but definitely,
Yeah, we're
for
smashing it.
we are smashing it, yeah. So particularly for small molecule antimicrobials, we of course have a fairly big medicinal chemistry department at Infex, and some of the stuff they do is absolutely fantastic, and it's pretty well understood how you can get small molecules into both gram-positive and gram-negative organisms. We know what changes will help with that process. But I think, as I mentioned before, the key difficulty with antimicrobial drug development is just the eternal evolutionary power of bacteria. So it's not just a case of getting things into bugs, but also, they have a variety of mechanisms to pump those drugs back out. They have acquired resistance mechanisms to break down those drugs. So it's not as cut and fast as, we've got the medchem to fix the problem. Bacteria are highly adaptable, and that's really the challenge for us.
In a perfect world, I'm gonna start with you, Vicky, and then ask this to Colm. What would, in the perfect world, a great drug discovery pipeline look like in terms of getting it from the lab to humans?
For an individual program, ideally you have your target product profile, so we call it, what infection type you want to treat, the spectrum of bugs that you want to treat within that infection type. That's defined from the beginning, and throughout the preclinical stages, the drug should be safe, very safe, both in vitro, so in sort of test tube testing, and also in animal models. It should be highly efficacious, and then the clinical development. It's not just it working, it being safe, but when you're developing a drug that targets resistant bacteria, for example, it's trying to find the patients who have those resistant bacteria. So your clinical development plan needs to be well thought out and enable you to get there with your drug. And of course, ideally, you have all the funds to do it. You have deep pockets to be able to fund all these expensive phases that we've discussed before, for you to launch your drug. And also, ideally, it should be relatively future-proofed, so as not to be susceptible to resistance mechanisms that might evolve further down the line.
Yeah, so when things sort of do go right, and we get these new drugs, these are causes for celebration. Recently GlaxoSmithKline, they've put forward a drug called, I'm going to call it correctly as it's written down, it's either gepotidacin or gepotidacin, drug for the treatment of UTIs or sort of gonorrhea, including multi-drug resistant strains. This sounds like a good thing. Is this a good thing in terms of from your perspective? Start with you, Vicky.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Any new antimicrobial that gets to market for me is an absolute win. It's a win for patients, it's a win for the area, it's a win for clinicians. Gepotidacin, you've mentioned, it's under evaluation for urinary tract infections, also known as cystitis to the general public, and gonorrhea. So it's the urinary tract infection trial which was stopped early because the data looks so good. It's a completely new drug of a new class. So let us hope that the gonorrhea trial yields similar results, because both of these areas have got resistance problems. But of course, as with all new drugs, the proof will really be in real world use. How does it stack up when it's used in patients? What's the longevity of the drug like? But fantastic news for GSK and for patients.
I like that you said for GSK first. Someone's angling for a new job. I see. All that GSK money. I understand. Sort of going forward there, this is, we are talking about antimicrobial, sort of antibiotics, but I know that it's not just these. What roles do other treatments or things like vaccines play in the future when it comes to these sort of illnesses?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's multiple technologies these days for tackling AMR. There's all sorts of things. We've got virulence inhibitors. So instead of killing the bacteria, we just inhibit their ability to cause infection. Potentiators, which can make bacteria susceptible to antibiotics, antibodies. There's resistance breakers, so things that knock down key resistance mechanisms in bacteria to restore the activity of antibiotics, and things like phages. They've been in the press quite a bit. There's some really exciting sort of phage therapies in clinical development. So there's definitely a variety of ways to tackle AMR. You mentioned vaccines. I think vaccine development in bacteria has been quite difficult because bacteria are incredibly complex compared to things like viruses, and they have a knack for evading the immune response. But I really do think a combination of all of these approaches is what is needed to support antibiotic stewardship, but also to overcome AMR in general.
I think that's a very comprehensive summary by Vicky. No, I totally agree with that. Certainly, the early pipeline is very innovative. The World Health Organization produces regular reports about the pipeline, and certainly some of the reports in recent years have been fairly depressing reading about the late development pipeline, the pipeline when it's near to market. But the early development pipeline, as Vicky has said, has a whole range of new approaches that I think are massively important, and we need the healthcare system to help support the further development and get these to market, and ensure that the companies and the products are sustainable once they get to market.
And so, like with that, Vicky, you mentioned with GSK and this new drug that the clinical trial was stopped early because the data seemed so good, and over the last 2 years, obviously, the big thing in terms of scientific research, in terms of clinical trials, has been sort of COVID vaccines. Now, what has the drug discovery world like? Have they learned major things from that?
For me, the COVID-19 pandemic, it really shows what can be achieved by the scientific community when sort of capacity and money is almost no object. How quickly things can move from relatively early stages into clinical trials and then into people. When there's no bottlenecks in terms of finances or manufacturing, it's really impressive how quickly these vaccines came through. I mean, I think vaccine development is quite different from therapeutic drug development, but there probably is some learnings that we can take from the COVID-19 vaccine trials, sort of hybrid approaches to trials to speed up the process, if you like. So this is something we've sort of used on our Respex trial at Infect. So this is an antibody for a key pathogen, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So we've sort of adopted like a hybrid trial for our phase 1 to include both sort of healthy volunteers and some patients as well. So there's definitely learnings for it. But I think a key thing probably for governments to learn, in fact, is like the preparedness when it comes to infectious disease. For all we know, the next pandemic is going to be a bacterial pathogen. Some would say AMR is the silent pandemic, which is already here. So definitely learnings in terms of preparedness.
And Colm, like from your perspective, because this is a completely natural segue, in terms of your perspective from that, have there been major learnings that we can then apply to sort of AMR?
I think the answer is yes. I think Vicky's touched on the main ones, and I suppose Vicky's already mentioned this about trials, but I think certainly from a clinician's perspective, what's been fantastic about COVID were the trial networks and how these platform trials and multiple therapies being tested at the same time, and then the ability to adapt the trial as it's going forward if one therapy is not effective and it dropping out of the trial and different. So there's been an enormous advance in showing, certainly in the UK and I'm sure in other parts of the world, but particularly the UK, the trial networks and how they've designed those trials to, rapidly assess some of these new COVID therapies that have been coming on board. And I think B, the value of diagnostics. I mean, the fact that people were swabbing themselves and using lateral flow tests as well as pitching up for more standard PCR tests. There's a much better understanding of the importance of diagnostics, and I think we need to use that in the AMR arena.
And in terms of sort of taking positives from negatives and from difficulties, like with how drug discovery works, as I'm understanding from you both of you, there's a lot of collaboration there. Like, very, very briefly, and I mean that because we have very limited amount of time left with you two, how do you think collaboration can help us move forward? Are there any areas still, as we sort of learn how to discover drugs and implement them into healthcare, where collaboration can be super key?
Collaboration, as I mentioned before, antibiotic drug discovery is predominantly done by small companies, and as a small company, you can't do it all. So collaboration is absolutely essential, particularly in the early stages of drug discovery. I mentioned before, a lot of discovery and early stage stuff is done by universities. So there's been an excellent collaboration set up in the Northwest called ICON, which is the Infection Innovation Consortium. And this is sort of between Liverpool universities, Liverpool Clinical Trial Facility, Infex Therapeutic, and several other companies. And it's really set up effectively a centre for excellence covering all stages of drug development, from discovery through preclinical and then the clinical trial capability as well. So really using everyone's strengths within the area to try and best accelerate drug development in infection, including AMR. So collaboration is absolutely essential in this space, and it will be required for us to get more drugs to market.
Let's say you open your email tomorrow morning. I'm not going to let you do it today because it's almost midday and it's lunch. You start tomorrow. You open your email, and at the top there is an email that has like everything in big caps. And that email, whatever's in that email, has made you 1,000 times more optimistic for the future of, solving AMR. What would be in that email?
Probably international sort of joined up pull mechanisms, that Colum's been talking about really nicely for us. Mentioned the UK one. There's a similar pull mechanism in the US, the Pasteur Act, that's trying to get through Congress. It's an international effort that needs to come to fruition, really. As I mentioned, that will really reinvigorate the space, both in terms of big pharma involvement and also private investment as well.
And Colm, for you open up your hospital computer. What is in that email that makes you go, yes, I'm 1,000 times more optimistic?
Pasteur Act is a really key one in the States because it's very significant funding in the hundreds of millions of dollars to billions of dollars for new products. I think that's a game changer because it totally changes the discussions that early developers will have with venture capital or other funders, because it creates a potentially more sustainable market for antimicrobials.
Wonderful. That was brilliant. Well, both of you, thank you so much. I think that is it. You have both smashed it in terms of your jobs, but also like here today. So thank you very, very much. All right, that is it from us today. Make sure you join us again next episode, where I'm chatting all things antimicrobial resistance and diagnostics with Dr. Tina Joshi, Professor of Microbiology at Plymouth University, Dr. Kamini Walia from the Indian Council for Medical Research, and we get to hear from one of ITV's favourite health and medical experts, Dr. Hilary Jones. All right, see you next time.